Good evening. So, a lot is happening or not happening in the parliament in this winter session, but we are live here today, this evening, to talk just briefly about the One Nation, One Election initiative, which has taken one step forward. Now, in spite of the constant disruption in both the houses of the parliament, Rajya Sabha as well as Lok Sabha, with the opposition blaming the ruling party and the ruling government saying that the opposition is disrupting. Today, the Union Council of Ministers, the cabinet, which met under the chairmanship of PM Narendra Modi, granted approval to one comprehensive bill to take forward the One Nation, One Election initiative. Though the details are not available because it has to be tabled in the parliament tomorrow or as soon as possible as form of a bill, but we know the general and the generalities of the same, and let's see how the matter would be steered henceforth. Now, this is not something which has popped out of the box very unexpectedly. In March, the committee headed by the former President Ramnath Kovind, had submitted the report after pretty extensive consultations. And of course, the whole discussion was on expected lines, with the opposition saying, no, this is anti democratic, whereas the government, as well as the parties aligned with the government, saying that we waste too much time in elections. And there are other countries in the world also, more particularly the United States of America, which of course has the presidential form of government, having elections after 4 years and the midterms after 2 years, whereas we waste a lot of time in elections in Lok Sabha, the Vidhan Sabhas, and then sometimes when those assemblies and Vidhan Sabhas are dissolved prematurely, then we have elections there. So what the country essentially is doing is, just conducting elections, and there's very little time for governance. And of course, arguments such as wasting precious resources in terms of finance, in terms of the effort and energy of the people and the political parties. So, be that as it may, in May, this report was submitted, and in September this year, so barely 2, 3 months ago, the Union Council of Ministers had approved that in principle, which essentially meant that we are going to take the former President Ramnath Kovind's report forward. So, what's the new that has happened today? What has happened today is that now one comprehensive bill, which is supposed to bring about as many as 18 amendments. So we are not clear as to how many of them are going to be constitutional amendments, but surely there are. And these amendments are going to affect 3 articles of the Constitution of India and the 3 laws. And those laws, of course, would be the Representation of People Act, and in both the versions. And therefore, we are going to see one comprehensive bill which is going to not only amend the various provisions of the Constitution, but also the laws, which would be tabled in the Parliament sooner than later. It'll be interesting to see whether they introduce this in the Lok Sabha or in the Rajya Sabha. The only difference between the two, there is no legal difference, is that a bill which is introduced in the Rajya Sabha does not lapse, because Rajya Sabha is a continuous house, whereas any bill which is introduced in Lok Sabha would automatically lapse unless it is passed by the Lok Sabha during the currency or during the lifetime of the House of People in which it was introduced. That's one. The other interesting point to be seen would be whether this would be taken up for voting immediately in the winter session, or will they consign it, like the Waqf bill, to the parliamentary committee. Now, there are arguments both for and against. The argument of not taking it to the parliamentary committee is that, well, President Kovind, rather, the former President Kovind's committee had very extensive consultations, and therefore, once the Union Cabinet has accepted that in principle, what is the point in further taking to another round of consultations? We already have, as we say, too much of democracy. Now, let's go forward. The other way is that what the committee had said was a general thing, and they had also, of course, underscored and underlined the various constitutional amendments and the amendments in the central laws that would be required to put into effect. But fact of the matter is, the black and white, duly vetted by the Ministry of Law as being constitutional, that of course has been approved only today. So therefore, let's give the political parties time to present their views on more specific, and now that the contours are in black and white, more specific provisions on which they would like to comment. So this would be clear. Tomorrow, two questions: whether it would be introduced in Lok Sabha or Rajya Sabha, and whether upon immediate introduction it would be taken into discussion, or whether it would be consigned to a parliamentary committee like the Waqf bill. Now, what does this bill really envisage? We have seen this happening earlier, and a lot has been written. There has been a lot of debate in the media. But essentially, what it seeks to achieve is that we should have synchronous and simultaneous elections of the Lok Sabha and the various Vidhan Sabhas, full stop, from a date to be notified by the president after all these constitutional amendments and legal amendments have been duly carried out and notified. And that's phase one. And within 100 days of the same, you would have the Panchayati Raj institutions of all dimensions, Gram Panchayats, block level samitis, Zilla Parishads, as well as the municipal bodies of municipal councils A, B, and municipal corporation, the bigger ones, within 100 days. And what is significant is that you would have one uniform electoral roll. Now, these days you have different electoral rolls for, of course, common for Lok Sabha and Vidhan Sabha, but you have different for the Gram Panchayats and different for the municipal bodies. And sometimes you have a person who's recorded as a voter in a village for Gram Panchayat, then he's also recorded in the city, and for Lok Sabha he's registered as an elector in the native state of Bihar. So all those type of complications and claims and counterclaims would of course be settled if you have one single electoral roll cutting across, whether you are having elections for the Lok Sabha or whether you're having for Vidhan Sabha or urban local bodies or Panchayati Raj institutions. And of course, it would be a photo ID card. It's not clear that whether it would be Aadhaar linked, but it cannot but be Aadhaar linked, because if you want to weed out duplicate voters, then Aadhaar linkage is a must, irrespective of the privacy considerations. Of course, Supreme Court and government and even the Aadhaar authority has stated on more occasions than one that Aadhaar card is merely an evidence and a proof of your identity, because it has your biometrics in terms of the thumbs, fingers, and your retina scan, but it is not a proof of your citizenship. So this single electoral roll, comprising people who have attained the age of 18 years on a cutoff date, would also be a kind of a citizen of the register, in my personal opinion. Of course, the other citizens who are under the age of 18, whether and when they will be covered is entirely different thing. But the electoral rolls would be one comprehensive, overarching roll comprising citizens who are ordinarily the resident in that area and therefore to be registered as voters for that particular polling booth. Now, here is the important part which I would like to underscore, that the process of taking this through is that at the end of the day, it is a constitutional amendment, irrespective of the challenges that may come subsequently in terms of challenging the constitutional validity, whether it offends the basic features theory enunciated in the case one of the Bharati case, so on and so forth. That would be if and when it is carried through. So, what has to now happen is very important. And this is where I think we need to focus, or the opposition parties would be focusing on, in my personal opinion. So, it is what is the process in case this bill is introduced? What is the passage of this bill? Since it is a constitutional amendment, it has to be passed by each of the two houses of parliament by two-thirds of the members present and voting. Now, this is very important. Two-thirds, not of the total membership. So, if you have 542 on the day on which you vote, if there are only 300 members present, then all you require is 200 members. Now, 200 members may be a minority with reference to the overall membership of the House, but that is what is meant by members present and voting. And similarly, in case of Rajya Sabha as well, members present and voting. Of course, we saw when the Delhi Services Ordinance was to be passed by Rajya Sabha, and this was something which was affecting the governance of the National Capital Territory of Delhi. The ordinance has already been promulgated, had to be taken into law. A simple majority of Rajya Sabha was required, and therefore the opposition parties and the ruling regime, they were literally locked in a tooth and nail battle at that particular point in time. But there you required only a majority of the members present and voting. Everyone was issuing whips for their members to be present. So the crucial and the critical obstacle as far as the government is concerned, and the critical and the crucial safeguard as far as the opposition is concerned, is the Rajya Sabha. So when this bill comes to Rajya Sabha, the members present and voting has to be two-thirds. Only then will this constitutional amendment go forward. You can, of course, amend the relevant provisions of the Representation of People Act 51, 52, or 53, whatever, but those alone will not suffice. This is a package of 18 amendments, and the constitutional amendments are a part and parcel of it. And therefore, as far as government is concerned, Rajya Sabha getting its numbers right and getting two-thirds of the members present and voting to vote is the crucial bottleneck. Then, of course, under the provision of the Constitution, this is something which affects the states as well. So, in my personal opinion, this is one of those amendments where 50% of the state legislatures must pass resolutions in support of it. I remember when the 72nd and the 73rd amendments concerning Panchayati Raj institutions and urban local bodies were brought about, this had to go through this process of the state legislatures approving. And now, equally, I think if it gets through the parliament, before it is finally notified after the assent of the president, you will have to have the 50% of the state legislatures. And given the complexion and composition of the Vidhan Sabhas across the country right now, the ruling NDA or the BJP and its allies should have a smooth sailing. So the critical portion here again is the Rajya Sabha. Of course, the composition of Rajya Sabha is changing literally on a weekly basis. Some members are retiring. You've got elections coming up in a few days. But I do not think that the ruling party has two-thirds majority as of now. But of course, if some people are absent on that day, do not come to vote, and when the split takes place, voting and the counting is done, then you may have some problem for the opposition. Now, what happens? Let us say this is taken through. What does one see the potential problems? There are two levels of problems which I foresee. One is a simpler one, and the second one is a more complex one, of which at least I cannot have a solution in my mind, conceptually speaking. Now, as far as the state assemblies are concerned, let us say everything goes on. You got a new Lok Sabha on day zero and new Vidhan Sabhas, and suddenly in one particular Vidhan Sabha, the government falls, a party splits, and you don't have a consensus and no one is really commanding a majority, what happens? We impose president's rule, 6 months plus 6 months. Those are the constitutional provisions of Article 356 right now. But what thereafter? You have to have fresh elections. During that particular period, the president has the option of either to dissolve the House or to keep what it is stated in the Constitution in suspended animation. Suspended animation actually allows the political process to take place. And of course, mergers can take place, splits subject to the constitutional provision of the anti defection law, and so on. The independent members taking a call. But fact of the matter is, if the matter is not resolved, then all you can do is hold fresh elections, which goes against the very, very basic concept of the seminal concept of simultaneous election. So therefore, let us say if Maharashtra or Andhra Pradesh has a split and the composition of the House becomes such, or the political situation becomes such, that you cannot have a government forming, then I think the only option would be that for the remaining period, you would have the president's rule. So whether this is a truly democratic functioning or setup, and president rule effectively would mean that the central government is then ruling it. Even the budget of the state during president rule is passed by the parliament. So this would happen in case of states. Now, what happens in case there is an unstable composition in the Lok Sabha? And right now, of course, we are talking in terms of 400 par and 303, and you have 270 or 260 or whatever. The question is, what happens in case you have an unstable Lok Sabha? And mind you, we've had stable Lok Sabhas for a pretty long time, but during our recent years in memory, and at least during the period I was in active service, and more particularly doing district and thereafter as observer, we had elections in 1996, we had elections in 1998, we had elections in 1999, which threw up the Vajpayee government, and even the election in 1991 to 1996, the Narasimha Rao government was essentially a minority government. Now, what happens in the not very unlikely, I would say, event of no party having a majority or a difference of opinion, the allies falling apart? All type of stories and alternatives are possible. So what happens? Friends, in the Constitution of India, and I'm sure even in these amendments, it does not envisage president's rule at the center. The Constitution says there has to be a Council of Ministers. And a member of the Council of Ministers need not necessarily be member of either House of Parliament, but has to become one within what? 6 months. So therefore, let us say the Lok Sabha is split and the Prime Minister of the day submits his or her resignation. And of course, once the Prime Minister submits the resignation and the President accepts, then the entire Council of Ministers ceases to exist. The President may, of course, say that please continue till alternative arrangements are made. But that Council of Ministers, that Prime Minister and his team, literally has no legitimacy because they are not commanding a majority in the Lok Sabha. So how will they pass the budget? How will they pass the normal laws? Let us say they don't pass the normal laws. The president can promulgate an ordinance which stays there for 6 months. You can re-promulgate it. I mean, you've had instances where an ordinance was promulgated and then re-promulgated 3 times. I think it was the New Land Acquisition Act or some proposed amendments there too. But fact of the matter is that the Council of Ministers must command a majority in the Lok Sabha. So therefore, what will then happen? There is no Lok Sabha. You cease to be member of that. You can't continue in the Council of Ministers for 6 months. Okay, you say the president for the remaining time will have a new Council of Ministers, maybe experts, technocrats, economists, retired army generals, and then continue. But how will you then pass the budget? You have to have a Lok Sabha to pass the budget, because without the appropriation bill, you cannot, from the Consolidated Fund of India, draw even a single penny. So, therefore, the budget has to be passed before 31st of March. And if your Lok Sabha is not able to agree onto a budget, or Lok Sabha has been dissolved and there is no Lok Sabha to pass the budget, do you expect the president then to be, promulgating ordinances for running of the government? Fine, if it's 3 months, 4 months, one can understand. But if the Lok Sabha collapses within 2 years, you cannot have a protracted president's rule as a lame duck government, in my opinion, at the center. And there are serious and potentially very, very dangerous possibilities which emerge. The president may not always be a rubber stamp. The president is also the supreme commander of the armed forces. The president is the person who appoints the, the Chief Justice of India, and of course also the Chief Election Commissioner and various constitutional authorities the president is appointing. And of course, all those appointments are when advised by the Union Cabinet. But if the Union Cabinet has resigned or has been dismissed and does not command the majority in the Lok Sabha, and the Lok Sabha itself has been dissolved, then you're saying that you will have a synchronous election and wait for 2 years, 3 years. It, to me, does not make any sense. And on the other hand, it can potentially make a president as a dictator who can have a rubber stamped council of ministers picked up from Rajya Sabha and maybe from outside and changing them like, rotating Chinese checkers or Russian roulette after every 6 months, and then being advised by that so-called cabinet. And the constitutional provisions are that what advice the cabinet gave to the president cannot be inquired into, and the president is the supreme commander, and you are potentially creating a situation where you are sowing the seeds on absolute dictatorship in a country which is a federal republic. So I'm sure that when these things are discussed and debated, this question of what would happen in the event, and I wouldn't say unlikely event, in an event which has happened on numerous occasions, what would happen even if you start with a very stable government like the VP Singh government, the Morarji Desai government, and even the Vajpayee government. There comes a time on some issues, there are differences between what were till yesterday, very, very strong allies. So therefore, we have, I would say that the Indian Republic and the Indian polity is at a point of inflection. And it is also a point of a reflection for all of us to see that while in principle it looks very attractive to have this idea of one nation, one elections, and we can live with the state under president's rule for 2 years, 3 years. Of course, Punjab, you had president rule protracted and you amended the constitution. At least I remember when Surjit Singh Barnala government was dismissed in 1987, you had the next government coming in 1992. So 5 years, the state of Punjab was under president's rule, and nothing really bothered anyone except the people were deprived of electing their own representatives, in spite of the fact that in 1989 you had Lok Sabha elections all over the country and also in Punjab, and that was the time when the VP Singh government emerged. So, friends, interesting to see. It's not for us to get into the question of constitutional validity of these, but definitely these would be very interesting to see as to what are those 18 amendments, what are the constitutional articles that are going to be amended, and how and which of the laws are going to be amended. So, in principle, and the crux of this little live talk, which I wanted to have without following a script, was essentially 2 points emerge. One is that Rajya Sabha is really, from the point of view of opposition, the last defense if they want to oppose this, because this would require two-thirds of the members present and voting in Rajya Sabha. So the opposition would be well advised to ensure the presence of the members and not create a raucous, so that the presiding officer of the House kind of suspends them. And if a member who's suspended obviously cannot participate in the Rajya Sabha proceedings, and the numbers present and voting would obviously skew in favor of the ruling party. To avoid that, and Rajya Sabha is the major line of defense. And other thing which I think people from all across the parties, and including the ruling party, must reflect as to what would happen, because you're making a change in the constitution would be there for all times to come. You may not necessarily have a Modi 1, Modi 2, or Modi 3 government for all times to come that is stable. You could have something like the H.D. Devegowda, the I.K. Gujral, and Charan Singh, VP Singh, Moraji Desai, and even the Vajpayee government, which lasted merely for 13 days. So, what are you going to do? Are you going to then, in the event of a deadlock, have president rule at the center, which would effectively mean the dictatorship under the president? Or are there going to be very innovative safeguards in this comprehensive bill, which will see the light of the day maybe tomorrow or in the following week? So, friends, there are a few comments. I don't know whether I would be able to. So, Mr. Gafoor has asked questions, and they're more in nature of observations. So, I think I have tried to put forth my views. And in case there are other questions, since this was live on all the three portals of YouTube, as well as Twitter, X, and Facebook, if there are questions, I'd be glad to answer them subsequently. But for now, thanks for joining in. Take care and have a great evening ahead. Goodbye and good night.